Good morning. Isaiah 61 really is a beautiful passage. Beautiful passage that speaks to us of the workings of God. And you might recall that some of what Luke read for us there was also read by another prominent figure, Jesus. Jesus read these same words in Luke chapter 4. Luke 4, Jesus opens up the scroll of Isaiah to this very passage and says, "The Lord has appointed me to bring good news to the afflicted, to send me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners." And you recall that after he reads that, he closes, he hands it back to the attendant, and he says that this prophecy has been fulfilled in your hearing. Jesus came to accomplish what was just read for us. Jesus came to accomplish these things. And as we think about how Jesus did that in our lives, he came to liberate you and has liberated you. He came to bind up your brokenhearted and has bound them up. He came to set us free and has set us free. So what do we do next? What follows after these things that Jesus said, that is what I've come to prophesy? Well, if your Bibles are still in Isaiah 61, notice a couple of things. Verse 3 tells us one of the things that happens next is you become a forest. You become a forest to the glory or the righteousness of God. Oaks of righteousness grow up from what Jesus has done. A forest appears from what Jesus has done of people who are there to glory God. Verse 4 said, people arise out of what Jesus has done to rebuild that which has been broken. The broken cities, the broken peoples, the generations of devastation and desolation. People arise out of what Jesus has done to work in these things. Verse 6, he says, you will be called priests of the Lord. Priests arise out of what Jesus has done. And then verse 11 ended. The Lord will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before the nations. Praise, the fruit of our lips, and righteousness in our lives, being seen by the world around us and shining out into the world around us. This is what happens. This is the beautiful image of what God said, I am going to do. It is the beautiful image of what He did in Jesus Christ. And it is the beautiful image of what continues to happen today. That's your life. When we spent this year talking about who we are as Christians, we are. This is who you are. What he just described in these passages. And if you're sitting there going, how? How do I do all that? If you're sitting there going, what is to be the result of all that? I feel like I'm trying to do it. Maybe I'm not doing it right because I don't see the result that I thought I would see. I don't see the nation rising up with righteousness and praise. Call your attention, the nation is not what rises up with righteousness and praise. Righteousness and praise rise up before the nation. Keep that in mind. But if you're looking, then you're going, how? Guess what? Peter must have had people that had the same question. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, he tells them, don't forget, you've been called out. And you are now a royal priesthood. You are now a holy nation, and you are here to proclaim the excellencies of God. He's saying the same thing that Isaiah 61 is saying. He's telling them Isaiah 61. He's telling us all about that. And then verses 11 and 12, he says this. He says, beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers, abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. He says, if you're asking yourself, how do I do what Isaiah 61 was talking about? How do I do what 1 Peter 2, verses 9 and 10 are talking about? He says in verses 11 and 12, this is how you do it. This is how you do these things. In fact, if you go back to chapter 1, it's interesting because right here in Peter, it's almost like Peter restarts his letter. He started writing him a letter, and notice how he begins it. In chapter 1, verse 1, he says, to those who reside as aliens scattered abroad. Or you might have other words there. You might have that there are those who are strangers or those who are exiles. We're talking about temporary residents. We're talking about people who are not permanently meant for this land, for this world. He says we've been called out of the world into marvelous life, into marvelous light. And so he also says in 1 Peter 1, so the one who called you out of that, he's holy. He's a holy God that called you out. And because he is holy, you should be holy. And so he says all that in chapter 1, but then when we get to chapter 2, verse 11, how does he start? He starts the letter over. Aliens, strangers, Christians, live as temporary residents. Be temporary residents in this world. Sam talked to us about this last Sunday night. Christian, remember who you are. Christian, remember where you're from. Christian, remember where you're going. He talked about these similar things. Temporary residents. What does that look like? He's going to spend the rest of the letter telling you. We're going to look at a few things from this letter for us to see. And we're going to see that together, how he lays that out in a few very specific ways of what it looks like to be temporary residents of this world and live holy lives according to the holy calling that you have been called by a holy God. But I want to say before we go on to that, I know some of you all are note takers. And I know sometimes I go a little bit too fast in my presentation of the slides. And because I don't want to put blast on Facebook about going too fast, I'm going to do this for you. Here's my notes. And you can write them down. And you go, oh, that's a lot to write down. We're going to go over it. But it's okay because if you don't get it wrote down, I'm going to put it at the bottom of every slide. And that way you can have it. And I hope that we all learn something from it. I have really learned something from considering these things. And for the person that knows I'm talking about them and they know I'm joking, everybody else can relax. He's like, what is he talking about? I'm giving somebody a hard time. So, what does this mean? Holy aliens live radically different lives than the world. Our lives look different than the world. You know where he tells us that? He tells us that in verse 12. Keep your behavior excellent amongst the Gentiles. Your life looks different than the Gentiles around you. Your life looks different than the world around you. Christians live in different ways. But because you do, and because you will, when you decide, I'm going to live in a different way, it's going to invite suffering. It's going to invite problems and hardships into your life. And at the time of Peter's writing this letter, they're trying to date this. It seems like it's early in Christianity. It's not likely that it's very late because the persecutions that he mentions are things like this, slander. They're going to slander you. And a little bit later, we'll read about insults and rejection. We know the persecution got much more physical. We know the persecution got much harder. But he says there's going to be suffering. Jesus promised that. He said you're going to go into this world and the world is going to feel judged by you. It's not that we judge the world, but our lives are different. And because our lives are different, they feel judged by that, and they don't like that. And he says that that's going to happen. They hated me, they're going to hate you. But take heart, I've overcome the world. Take heart, I've overcome the world. Take heart that suffering doesn't end with just pain. Suffering doesn't end without hope. Suffering brings glory, and it brings salvation, and it brings redemption. And there's a sense in which through Christian suffering, we show that God is greater than the world. People say, why do y'all keep putting up with it? Why do y'all just keep on going through this? Why do you keep suffering? Because we're believing that our God is greater than it. And it shows the world that. But in this chapter, in this verse, it seems that it may be that there are going to be those who see you suffer, and they're going to say maybe there's something to their God. Maybe in the day of God's visitation, they will believe in him, they will belong to him because they saw you. And they saw you suffer for what you believed, and yet not turn away from him because he is greater than the world and he has overcome the world. This is what our lives are about. This is what Peter is going to unpack, and this is what we're going to think about this morning. Because as we've gone through all these things about who we are, this month we're recognizing Christians, we are sufferers. And we need to understand what that means. We need to understand how that impacts us, and we need to understand why we need that. Why we need that in our lives. Suffering for the glory of God is what Christians do. Now, before we go on, and before I put those points back up here on the board, Satan has convinced us that suffering isn't real unless it's real bad. He's convinced us that you're not suffering for the Lord unless somebody dots your I. You're not suffering for the Lord unless somebody takes your home away. You're not suffering for the Lord unless it ends in death. Peter in this letter says suffering for the Lord involves insults. Suffering for the Lord involves losing friends because of Jesus. Suffering for the Lord involves having weird conversations with people who think, you know what, you're kind of crazy. You're kind of a loon for believing and acting the way that you do and for behaving the way that you do. It involves not being invited. It involves not being a part of. It involves being left out. It involves being different. All of these are pictures of suffering from how Peter describes it in this letter. So let us make sure we see exactly what he's talking about as he says, Christians glorify God, live different lives, and recognize that it's going to bring difficulty into them. The first way that he does this, back in chapter 2, read with me verses 13 through 17. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by being right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but as it is bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Now, what he just said right there is very different living than the world. It's very different living in the world. For starters, the government that he talks about, that he's writing about, is not our government. It's not the government we have today. He's talking about emperors. As he mentions the king, he's talking about emperors. Emperors who said, I am deity. I am a son of the gods. And their laws revolved around their belief that they were a deity, and it evolved around this pagan pantheon of gods. And so they made laws that were not friendly towards Christians, and they believed in morals. The morality of Rome was terrible. Sexual immorality ran rampant. Drunkenness was commonplace. And you hear that and go, well, that sounds a little bit like our government. That sounds a little bit like our life today. It wasn't. It was nothing like it. It was far worse. The things that were acceptable in those days. We think that things have gotten bad. I'm not saying they haven't, but things were really bad in those days. And he writes to Christians and he says, you submit yourself. Submit yourself to that government. Something that may have been on people's minds in that day is we need to start a rebellion. We need to fight back. We need to cause some civil unrest. There were Jews known as the Zealots. They're walking around shivving people. That's probably not what Christians should be doing. But if a few key figures got taken off the board, that would help us a whole lot. Peter says, no, you submit yourself to the government. Actually, change that. He said, you submit yourself to every human institution, to every government. Submit yourself to the one who makes the laws, to the emperor. Submit yourself to the ones who give the laws and enforce the laws. And I'm guessing that those laws weren't fair. I'm guessing those laws weren't righteous. Peter says you submit yourself to them. And for what purpose? Why should we do this? He says you do that for the sake of the Lord, and you do that because it's right. And foolish men are silenced by it. So you think about it like this. People see that. They see how the laws of Rome, they don't match up with the beliefs and the morals of Christianity. And they see how the Greeks and the Jews, they start uprising, they start rebelling. And they're saying, why do you all just go along with it? Why do you all put up with it? Why don't you all start a fight? And you get to tell them, because of my king. Because of my God. Remember 2:12, radically different lives lead to suffering, and it leads to the glory of God. Peter's explaining that here. That's how it happens. You observe submission before the government, and that's going to make you look weak. That's going to make you look not like the rest of the world. And they're going to probably treat you differently, but you can silence the mouths of foolish men through that by speaking the glory of God. Behave radically different. And Peter uses this amazing phrase. He says, act as free men, but don't use your freedom as a covering for evil, but as bondslaves of God. He says, freedom, you need to understand it correctly. Freedom isn't you get to do whatever you want. Freedom is I have rights. No, he says that's not what freedom is. Now, depending on his audience, the people that heard that, it's unlikely that many of them were truly free. They may not have been slaves, but they were citizens of Rome, in which many people were not truly free men. So it probably is that he's talking about their freedom in Christ. And you can hear how that might have sounded to a Christian in that day. You've been set free by Christ, and he's your king. So you know what? The laws that this king is making, the edicts that this government is pointing out, you can hear all the conservative Christians of the day, not my king, we're going to rise up. He says, no. That's not how we live. We live radically different lives. You see freedom as a chance to choose who you're going to be a slave to. That's what your freedom really is. You can be a slave to God and to his will and allow him to guide you and allow him to dictate the way that you speak and the way that you think, even about your government, because it matters. But I think that sounds a little bit different in our world, where we do have political freedom. We do have social freedoms in our country today. And despite that, God's word says, how do you think about those freedoms? Do you think that you have the freedom to be subjected? That's part of that freedom. You have the freedom to be a slave. And he demonstrates that here by obedience and honor. That's what that looks like. Obedience to the government and honor to the people that are in charge. And that freedom, he says, glorifies God when you see freedom in that way. But it does not glorify God whenever our decision is, I'm going to rebel against that. I am going to intentionally be disobedient to the laws of the land. I'm not doing what they've said to do because I don't feel like I should have to, because I don't like them. We're not glorifying God when we constantly criticize and constantly complain against the government. That's how everyone lives today. Left wing, right wing, moderate, everybody says, it's not, if you don't do it the way that I think you should do it, if you don't do it in a way that makes me happy, you're going to hear about it. I'm going to voice my complaints. I'm going to go online and tell everybody, I'm going to start protests. You're going to feel my wrath because we're going to fight the power until things change. You go, well, I don't know that that's really that bad. Okay, let's rephrase everything. He said, honor the king. How about this? Children, honor your father and your mother. That's what he's told children to do. Honor your father and your mother. And so you say, children, need you to go wash the dishes. Children, need you to go clean your rooms. Children, we're not going to that event because it's a Saturday night and we want to be ready for Sunday. Children, there's going to be things at that movie that we don't feel comfortable with you watching. We're not going to watch that movie. And they go, you're the worst parent in the world. This guy's parents let him do that. I wish I was that person's kid. I want to go be with them. I don't like the decisions you make. I'm not happy with them. Would you feel honored with their criticism? Would you feel honored with their complaints? He says, honor the king. And he's speaking about a pretty vile person. Doesn't mean that we have to be excited about everything. Doesn't mean we have to be excited about wickedness. I mean, excited about the poor decisions. Doesn't mean that we can't partake in the liberties that we have to try and make changes in our society. But we must remember that we're called to do it differently than the world around us. We're called to submit to our government. And that doesn't matter if you live in Rome or if you live in China or you live in Russia or if you live in the United States. You submit to the government, and people say, what is wrong with you? Why do you live this way? Why do you act this way? You're just being weak, and you're being fearful. You're just being afraid. You know what you're being? You're being a sheep. Yes, that's exactly, we have an opportunity to silence the mouths of ignorant men. Ignorant, not as in they're stupid, not as in they're idiots. They don't get it. They don't see. Yes, I am a sheep, and I have a shepherd, and he is my true king. And he said, live this way. And he said, it's far greater to live this way than to live like the rest of the world. I want to glorify him. I want to show his righteousness. So I submit to the government. Then he goes on to say this in verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor for the sake of conscience towards God. A person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if when you sin you are harshly treated? You endure it with patience. But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you endure and patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. So again, this is different than our world today. When he says, servants, submit yourself to your masters, he is not talking about the employee-employer relationship. He is talking about slaves and masters. In the first century, this was far more common. This was far more acceptable. And you were sometimes a slave because you were in debt. You were sometimes a slave because you chose to put yourself into that position to try to provide something for your family. But you couldn't just say, in either case, I think I'm done. You couldn't turn in your pink slip. This was your life, and this is who you were. And he says, in this moment, you submit yourself to your master. And we might look at that and say, okay, we can do that. We submit ourselves to our master. And I think if we correlate the thoughts that he says there about slavery to employer-employee relationship, we see that it is still applicable, and it is maybe even more greatly seen in that light. So we say, okay, I can do that. I'm going to do what my master says. I'm going to do what my boss says. I'm going to do it without complaining. I'm going to, I'm not going to steal from them. I'm certainly not going to try to kill them whenever things don't go the way that I want it to go. I'm going to submit to my master. But he adds an extra phrase in there. He says, submit to your master with all respect. And all of a sudden, we really want a qualifier. With all respect, if he's a respectable person. With all respect, if he's a good boss. But the qualifier that he gives us is just the opposite. With all respect, if he's a good boss, but even if he's completely unreasonable. I think it's interesting, that's the word he uses, unreasonable. The things that they ask of you have no reason, and they have no benefit. And you can picture, you've had that boss likely, I know I've had that boss, where you sit back and go, how did you get this job? Why are you doing this? And they ask you to do things that somebody else has already done, or they ask you to do things that they should be doing, and you really need to spend your time somewhere else, and your productivity looks bad, and the whole team looks bad, and you know, this is going to have a direct impact on my life. Maybe I'm going to miss out on bonuses because I'm not going to get things done that I feel like I should get done, that the company thinks I should get done, because I'm trying to pick up the slack from this guy that has no idea what he's doing. He shouldn't be in this position. Submit to him with all respect. And in that, you imagine how that's going to stand out. Not only are you suffering to work under this unreasonable boss, but think about all your coworkers. All your coworkers who are complaining about him, all your coworkers who get together and say, you know what? We're not coming into work today. We're going to strike. We're not going to be a part of this. We're not going to listen to him anymore. We're not going to take it anymore. And you cross that line and you walk before that boss and you know he's unreasonable and you know that he doesn't deserve to have your respect, and you say, what can I do today, boss? You think about suffering. You will find out real quick about suffering. You'll find out real quick about how serious people take moments like that. And they'll say, why are you doing this? You're a coward. You won't stand with us. You are fearful, and you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity in their insults and in their rejection, and oftentimes situations like that can lead to violence. You have an opportunity to shut the mouth of foolishness and say, let me tell you about my true master. Let me tell you about my God. Let me tell you about what he has called me to be. And you know what? You're going to probably lose out on money. If you live this way, he doesn't say, live like this because that unreasonable boss is going to pay you better. First of all, he's talking to people that weren't getting paid many times. Sometimes they were, but oftentimes they weren't. He doesn't say you're going to get paid better. Instead, he says, live like this way and you're going to find favor. I don't know if you knew this or not, but that word favor is the Greek word charis. He said, live like this and you're going to find grace. You're going to be paid. Your income from this sort of work is not monetary, it's spiritual. It is grace. God says, I see, and I am the one that gives the reward. And it kind of does give an interesting view towards Christian labor ethics. What does the Bible think about Christian ethics? When we think about labor ethics, we think about the right to pay. Right? The right to have a fair pay. We have the right to a safe work environment. We have that. That's what we think of. The right to be heard by your management. Management needs to have a way for me to bring complaints to them and for them to take those complaints and do something with them. We have these sorts of rights. What does the Bible talk about? Well, for one thing, the Bible brings up almost no views of the worker's right. Instead of viewing the worker's rights, it views the worker's obligation. It gives more and more view on what the worker should be doing as opposed to what they have the right to have. In this case, the master isn't referred to at all. They don't even say a single thing to him. Now in Colossians, we have a very similar set of lists that are dealing with slaves and masters and family, as we'll see in a moment. But there the master gets brought up, but he gets one verse. While the slaves get all these other verses. The obligation is on the workers. And it's much greater than on the obligation that he puts on the master. And he says the income is heavenly. The income that he focuses on, the income that he places at the heart of a Christian worker is from above. It's not to say that any of those other things should have no bearing or no part in our mind. I'm thankful for the rights that we have. And I'm thankful for protections that have been put in place in this country. But if they're all gone tomorrow, that doesn't change our job as Christians. Our job is to live radically different lives. And sometimes that's going to cause suffering through insult, rejection, and worse. But through that, we have an opportunity to bring glory to God and for others to see His glory and find salvation and find redemption. The next point that he makes is in chapter 3, and he talks about husbands and wives here. We're going to read them both together. Verses 1 through 7 says, in the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. As they observe your chaste and respectful behavior, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of the gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker since she is woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Now, a couple of things before we get into that. How many of you listened to me read that and went, wow, that is an incredibly progressive text. That was really forward thinking. I didn't expect to see any hands come up for that. Many times we read that and we think even in Scripture, even in the church, we might read that and go, that feels, we could talk a little bit quieter about these sorts of verses. That feels barbaric. It feels reductive or oppressive. It's moving backwards. It's not saying enough about the things that we think it should say. But you know what? That letter ends up in the hands of Christian men in the first century. They'd have looked at that, they'd have read that, they'd have said, whoa, Paul is liberal. Paul is progressive. Peter here says the very same things that we just read. We're talking about Peter, not Paul. Peter is liberal. Peter is progressive. Because when you wanted to make changes in the society around you, and if I wanted to make changes in the first century to the way that women behaved, I didn't speak to the women. And if I wanted to make changes to the ways that slaves behaved, I didn't speak to the slaves because you didn't matter. I spoke to your husbands. I spoke to your masters. I said, husbands, make your wives act right. Masters, get your slaves into obedience. That's the way that the first century world spoke. And imagine how weird that a husband reading this letter, an elder of the church reading this letter, and all of a sudden he goes in, wives. Can I get that further? Brad, can we get that further away and hold it out here? Wives, I guess I need to turn this over to you all. He wants to talk to you. And he did. He was saying, wives, you are important. You are so important to God. You need to know how to live. You need to know how to act. And so what does he say? In the same way as he said the other things, in the same way, wives, live in submission to your husbands. And notice a few things about that. Submission to your husbands was about the way that you behave, verse 2. Verse 2, he says that they are to, is their conduct. They observe your chaste, respectful behavior, your conduct. Submission has to do with the way that you act. It has to do with the way we do with your behavior. He says in verse 4, let it be a hidden person of the heart, your gentle and quiet spirit. It's the way that you think. He said when you are living in submission to your husband, that changes the way you think about your husband, and it changes the way you think about submission. And even in verse 6, as he talks about Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, he was saying, even in the way that she talked, her language communicated, I'm going to be submissive to you. I'm going to choose to subject myself to you. So in word and in thought and in action, submission is a whole picture in that. And all of those pictures that Peter creates points to a radically different way of living. Radically different way of living as wives of husbands. And he doesn't say, and you do that when the husband shows that he's worthy of that. You do that when the husband shows he's a really good husband. He says, if your husband's not what he should be, you influence him not with your words, but with your conduct. Again, as we saw earlier, people are going to look at that and say, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you, women? Don't you know what century it is? What is wrong with you? Why do you live like that? And you have an opportunity. Christian wives, you have an opportunity to shut the mouths of ignorant men and proclaim the will of God for his glory. And I want you to look at the qualities of those for a moment. The qualities that he talks about there, these sort of heavenly qualities of godly wives. He says that they are chaste or pure, they are gentle, quiet, they are holy, and they are in fear of nothing. They are fearless. Think about that last one for a minute. The world has a very different view of you. If you live like this, the world does not think you are fearless. The world's view of fearlessness is the mighty warriors that we see depicted on our television screens and on our movies. Warriors, female warriors who are just as raunchy as their male counterpart. They can make the sick jokes just like the guys can do. They want to fit in with the dirtiness and the griminess of the men. And they have quick tongues that they use to cut down their opponents and to get the things that they want, get their promotions or get their sexual target, get their desires. They use their tongues to get what they want and destroy their competition. They live that sort of life of I am woman, hear me roar, right? That's a warrior. That's fearless. And God says, I'll tell you what's really fearless. I'll tell you what I see as a warrior in my soldiers of Christ. I see women who would submit themselves to her husband. That is fearless living. And a quick word before we jump on to the men. He says some things here in the middle about modesty. And I think it's important that we talk about them. I think we view this. One, I think it's important that we recognize he addresses it to women, but it's applicable across the board. It's true of men as well. It was true then, it's true today. It may be even more true today. That the men need to think about modesty more in the way that they dress. But what's funny is the way that he addresses modesty is not the way that we address modesty. We think of modesty. We say, okay, we're going to talk about modesty because there's people that aren't putting enough clothes on. We're going to talk about modesty because there's people got parts showing that shouldn't be showing. That's not the way that Peter talks about modesty. You notice he says, when he talks about modesty, he starts talking about things like braided hair and gold jewelry. And traditionally, we've read that. We've said, okay, you know what he's saying? He's saying you shouldn't have these great big elaborate hairstyles that says, everybody look at me. And you shouldn't have this jewelry that gets everybody's attention. It says, everybody look at me and look at my wealth and look at my influence and look at who I am. We read that, we get that. Then we get to that next line. If you're reading from the New King James, have fine apparel. New American Standard said dresses. If you are reading from the New King James, by the way, the word fine is in italics because the word fine is not there. That's added in by translators later because they're trying to make sense of what Peter said there. He said braided hair. He said gold jewelry. He gave a description of it. And then he said garments, clothing. That word is translated as garments or clothing almost every single time. The men at the cross fought over Jesus' garments. It's the same word. It just means clothes. So we read that and we go, braided hair, women, take down your braided hair. Jewelry, women, take jewelry. Jewelry, women, take it down, take off your jewelry. Clothes, women, put more on. Don't take it off, put more on. And we completely destroy the context of the passage. Because he's not talking about putting on and taking off. He's talking about who are you trying to get the attention of? Who are you trying to draw an eye of? And so there's some questions I think will be good to ask. Boys and girls, these are questions for you to ask yourself. Husbands, wives, men and women, all of us, these are questions that we should ask as we get dressed in the morning. Why am I wearing this? Why am I putting this on? Who do I hope will take notice? Whose eye is it that I'm trying to get hoping that they'll just take a glimpse of me and look a little bit longer? Whose praise is it do I want to hear? And there might be those here this morning that I got dressed this morning because I really do want someone to look at me and say, hey, I see all the work you've put into your life has paid off. You've made it. You're rich. You're successful. You've got money and it shows. You've made wise decisions. I really need that. There is maybe someone here this morning that has a hole in their heart going, I wish somebody would see me and say, you're beautiful. You are gorgeous. Maybe there's some here today that's just going, I just wish I've been putting in the time, I've been putting in the efforts, and I need someone to see my gains. I want somebody to see, hey, you can, 315, right? You can bench it. I can tell. It's been showing. What we need is to go back to the Lord and let the Lord say, yes, you are strong. You can do all things through me. What we need is to go back to the Lord and hear him to say, you are gorgeous. You're the most beautiful person I know. I am so attracted to you that I died that we might spend eternity together. Go back to God and let him say, you are successful. You've become an heir of Abraham, the wealth, the riches that are yours to possess, we can't even describe. We need to go back to God. That's what modesty is about, is stopping trying to get the attention of the world and drawing our hearts back to get the attention of God. God, we see what we really need is you and your acceptance and your praise. And when we live that way, we're going to get rejection. We're going to get insults from the world. People will see it, and we'll have an opportunity to glorify God. So husbands, let's jump back into what he says there, what he says to the husbands in verse 7. And I want you to recognize one of the first things that he says is in the same way. In the same way. When he said, submit yourselves to governments, submit yourself to masters, submit yourselves to husbands, and now husbands, it's your turn, in the same way, should tell us that he's going to talk about submission. He's going to talk about being subject to something. What is it that we're supposed to submit ourselves? What is it we're supposed to be subjected to? Well, he's going to describe what it looks like in a couple ways. Number one, he's going to say your lives show that you're in subjection to something through dwelling with understanding. And I think one of the things that we might need to understand about that is we are commanded to live with our wives in a certain way. Ephesians chapter 5, Paul writes to the Ephesians and says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So love your wives sacrificially. In that sense, submit yourselves to your wives' desires. Submit yourselves to your wives' will. Whenever she says that this is what I need, that is important to you. That goes to the top of the list. When she says that this is where I'm struggling, that has got all of your attention. Because you are dying to self and living to Christ. And he says, you know what it looks like to live to me? Put your wives first. Like I did to you. I lay down my life for you. Husbands, lay down your lives for your wives. But there's also a sense where that means understanding what it's like to be her, to be a woman. Understand what it means to be a woman in the world that we live in today. And I realize that's a difficult charge. Like, those are difficult words, what I just said. We have movies talking about it, making fun of the light of that. Live in such a way as to try and know what she deals with. Live in such a way as to try to understand the way that she perceives and the way that she experiences what's going on around her. And even if those things might not matter that much to you, you say, well, that's not important. We don't need to think about that. She thinks about it. Dwell in understanding with your wife and think about those things. And he says, show her honor as the weaker vessel. And that idea of the weaker vessel may be the sense, and we've probably seen things contrary to this, maybe the sense of the generality that husbands are oftentimes physically stronger than their wives. We've seen things that sometimes a wife is stronger than her husband. But even in that idea of living with them and showing honor to them, even as a weaker vessel, we need to recognize that draws back to the previous command. Dwell in understanding. If she is the weaker vessel, I honor her and I seek to understand, not just that God has commanded me to live this way, not just that she is a woman, but that she is my wife. And it is Holly that I'm seeking to understand. And her strengths and her weaknesses I'm seeking to understand. We go, that is such a suffrage to live this way, to understand these women and to honor these women. It's a suffrage. It's a suffrage because we're boneheads. It's a suffrage because we don't want to spend the time to do it. And the guy that says, all of his buddies, hey, we're going to go out, we're going to do something together. He says, you know what? I'm going to go home. I'm going to spend some time with my wife. I need to get to know her better. I need to just sit down and talk with my wife. You know what he's going to hear? The suffering he's going to get? Bah! He's whipped. He is whipped. He's got to go home and get his porch pass. He's got to get permission just to leave the house. Peter says, you suffer. And you put to silence foolish men and you glorify God. But he also says this, you suffer, you show understanding, and you show honor and you dwell with understanding. Because if you don't, that affects your relationship with God. It says that'll hinder your prayers. I don't know what that means. Does that mean that I'm not going to pray like I should? I'm going to pray more selfish prayers because I'm not trying to think about my wife? Maybe. But for all of you fathers out here with daughters, one day, and maybe some of you, you've already done this, maybe one day some of you, you're going to do this, you're going to entrust a man to care for her and to understand her and to put her as the most important thing because she's your princess right now and she's going to need to be his princess, and he doesn't care and he doesn't honor her, and he shows up at your doorstep and he says, Pops, I got a question I want to ask you. Pops, I got a favor. And do you hear a word out of his mouth? Or do you see the way he's treated your princess? See the way he's treated your daughter? He says, the way you treat God's princesses matter. It can hinder your prayers. I wonder if that's a picture of what he's talking about. It has an impact on our relationship with God. And you hear all that. Maybe you hear everything that I've said this morning, and you go, man, being a Christian doesn't sound fun at all. It sounds nothing but hard. It sounds difficult. Why would anybody ever want to do this? And I don't know the faces that you all make whenever other men get up and preach. When Ray Warfel gets up here and goes, turn to Mark and look at Psalm 23 and how many times it shows up in it, I don't know the faces that you make. When Tommy Peeler got up here and gave the lessons that he gave, and some of them sounded like you ripped them off of me, and that wasn't the case. I don't know the faces that you all make. But here's the face, because I don't turn around and look at you, but here's the face I imagine you make. You look at that and you go, wow. Did you see that point? Wow. And that's not the face you're making right now. And that's okay. I'm a thinly veiled, reformed hillbilly. I'm not that smart. It's okay. But that's not the reason you're not making that face. You're not making that face because this is hard stuff. This is weighty stuff, what he's telling us. This is who we are. You are going to suffer. That's difficult. Why would we want to live that way? He concludes, and we're not going to read these verses, but he concludes some of these thoughts in chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. He says, you're going to be treated evil. You're going to be insulted. You're going to be rejected. Here's how you respond. You bless them. You act harmoniously. You act sympathetically. You act kind-heartedly. You act brotherly. You act with humility. You give them a blessing in return. Why? Why would I choose to live lives like that? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, we skip these verses and maybe you notice, these are the reasons why. For you have been called for this purpose. Since Christ suffered for you, leaving an example for you to follow in his steps, he committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously. And he himself bore his sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your soul. The reason we live this way is because we're Christians. The reason we live this way is because that's who we are. The reason we live this way is because that's who he is. The reason we live this way is because that's what he's promised. When we are insulted, we don't insult back. Because he was insulted and he didn't insult back. His government insulted him and he took it. His government wrongly accused him and he submitted himself to his government. He died the death of a slave by the hands of those he had come to serve. So he treated them as if they were his earthly masters when our earthly masters mistreat us. We see the example of him. We work hard unto the Lord. We hear his words, I will count that into your account. There will be pay in your bank account of grace and of favor from God. He submitted himself to die for his spouse, for you and for me. This is the gospel call. See what he did and go be like him. So someone ever tells you, hey, Christianity is an easy thing. Christianity is an easy thing. You believe in Jesus and you follow him. You take them to 1 Peter and you go, really? Does this sound that easy to you? If you think it's easy, maybe it's time for me and you to sit down and talk about what Christianity really is. It is a hard thing. But let me ask you. Jesus lived an example for us of a life bold and fearless that ended in the glory of God. Is that what you're doing today? Is that your life this morning? There may be some here today who need to confess to the Lord, I have not lived as an oak of righteousness, as a priest of yours. Praise is not emanating from my life in front of the nations. And here in a moment, we're going to sing a song of encouragement. We're going to sing, Prepare to Meet Thy God. And I hope that you'll take a moment to pray to him and ask for forgiveness of that. Here in a moment, as we get ready to stand up, there may be those who recognize not only is my life not look like that, it hasn't looked like that for a long time, and I know it. And I've been trying, and I've been failing, and I would really like for it to turn around and look that way once again. But I need help. I hope that as we sing this song, you will recognize that we are a group of people who all recognize we have suffered, and sometimes we have chosen to run away from the suffering. We have not glorified God, and we've not lived radically different lives. And we're here to help. We're here to pray together, and we're here to hold up his word together, and we're here to push one another along. As we see the day approaching, we encourage one another all the more. So I hope that as we sing this song, you'll reflect on that, and if need be, you will come forward and find the help that you need. But if you're here today and you've not begun to follow Christ, because you're looking at all this and you're going, why would I want to? There's going to be suffering. Let me clear one thing up for you. Peter did not say, follow Christ and there's going to be suffering. Don't follow Christ, there will be no suffering. Everyone suffers. We all will suffer. People in this world suffer every single day. When he wrote to the Christians and he called them to live radically different lives and he said it's going to produce suffering in you, he also was saying this is the only path that leads to any purpose for suffering. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. The purpose. Where is God in suffering? But if you're here going, I want to escape suffering, I'm not going to become a Christian, know that the only thing you're going to find is suffering with no purpose. But thanks be to God, we can have a hope of an end of suffering when He will return and He will do away with suffering for eternity, and He will gather us in where we can see the glory, the redemption, the salvation, the end of our suffering because we followed the radically different life that He called us to. If we can assist you in beginning that today, please come forward and let's talk about it together as we stand and as we sing.